Maragadamu. In 2012, the TANA High-Level Forum on Security in Africa took off, bringing together quite a diverse community of Africans. What did it achieve? Joining me to discuss the forum's first 10 years is Dr. Hesphina Rukato, who has just published TANA 10, a celebration. Dr. Hesphina Rukato, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You were there at the TANA Forum, the TANA High-Level Forum on Security for Africa, right from the get-go.
Yes.
In the capacity of?
Yes, I was there as the first coordinator of the TANA Forum. Initially, I'd been recruited as an advisor, but then because of personnel changes within the IPSS, I ended up being the coordinator of the first TANA Forum.
And tell me about its inception, about its origins in 2011/12.
I think what you saw in 2012 was the birth of a very long process, which started in 2009 with the AU's Tripoli Declaration, which was on the elimination of conflicts in Africa and the promotion of sustainable peace. And in that declaration, the African heads of state and government pronounced that peace and security was not just for politicians and diplomats. It was also an intellectual challenge, which then brought in institutions like the IPSS to say, since it's now an intellectual challenge, what can universities do? What can other stakeholders that are not political do? And that was the inception of the TANA Forum on Peace and Security in Africa.
So they were desperately looking for inputs from just outside of the usual institutions that were providing?
Yes, I would say that it was a call up to all stakeholders to say, let's all take responsibility, and peace and security issues are beyond the scope of just the people that sit as diplomats in the AU or the politicians at national level or the regional economic communities. Academics and civil society, youth organizations, women organizations also have a role to play. So the Institute for Peace and Security then embarked on the journey to conceptualize what ended up being the TANA Forum on Security in Africa.
So the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at the Addis Ababa University, you say, was a natural, the logical home base for this institution, right?
I would say it became logical by virtue of leadership of individuals. And also it was, I would cite Professor Dr. Mulugeta Gabriel Hoyt. He was very instrumental in the initial, very, very basic conceptualization. And obviously with GIZ, we were also already working with Dr. Mulugeta on some other AU projects. And they also learned a lot and took some best practices from the German Munich conference, which is also held annually.
Right. So tell me about what exactly happened right at the beginning. So the experts worked on the framework for the establishment of this institution. How did it go?
By the time I was recruited, I think the idea was already there. It was now, how do we put it into practice? So the first space was identifying people that would participate. And what I liked about the principles of the TANA Forum from the beginning was that there was going to be gender equity. So for everything that was going to be done, we had to make sure there was equal representation of men and women, speakers and being on the panels, as well as young people, both female and male. And the major task was, who do we get to be the chair of the TANA Forum? And Prime Minister Zenawi was very instrumental and clear on what kind of a chair he wanted for the TANA Forum, because it had to be someone who commanded respect, someone who was also very well known for fundraising purposes, but someone who could also call upon sitting and former heads of state and speak to them as colleagues. because the idea was that we also then bring on board people that have experience in not just managing private sector companies, but also in managing countries, former heads of state and sitting heads of state. And that was where the impact of the TANA Forum was going to be.
So names were floated?
We had about 9 shortlisted candidates, and we ended up with former President Obasanjo of Nigeria. And I remember Prime Minister Zenawi then sending myself and Dr. Mulugeta to go and deliver a letter from the Prime Minister to President Obasanjo, inviting him to be the chair of the TANA Forum. And we arrived at his home, he received us, we had breakfast together, I think we even prayed together. And then afterwards, we delivered the letter and he said yes. And that's when the technical work started happening.
And he was going to be, he served as the chair for at least 8 years?
He served for at least 8 years, after which the now president of Ghana, John Dramani, took over.
So walk me through the first forum in 2012 in Bahir Dar.
We were all doing it for the first time. The preparations from security to room preparation, because when the Ethiopian government had settled on having the forum in Bahir Dar, they had settled on the Avanti Nile Hotel, which was still in construction. So 4 weeks before the forum was due to be held, the Prime Minister just issued an instruction. This is where the event is going to happen, and everybody just make it happen. I remember in 4 weeks, where we had seen no bedding in the hotel, no utensils in the hotel. I remember the Sheraton was given the responsibility, or it is their hotel. So they imported or brought all the utensils, everything that was needed from Dubai to make sure that the hotel was ready in the 4 weeks for the forum. With the airport, it was the same, and the security was put in place. All the young people were on board. So there was no one who could say, I am senior or I've experience in doing something like this. And that is where I say...
Informal, heavily informal.
Yeah, very. And everybody was involved in contributing something towards the success of the TANA Forum, especially the participation of the young people from the IPSS. We worked together as colleagues, Foreign Affairs, the Security Department. It was really so exciting, and responses were coming in. Everybody was saying yes to the invitation, so it was exciting.
So the theme for the first forum was managing diversity and what was it? State fragility?
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
Why was that selected as the key theme for the first edition, if you will, of this forum?
For managing diversity, for me personally, it was derived from some of the reports that were beginning to come from the APRM process, whereby, especially, I think it was the report of Rwanda.
The process is the peer review.
Yes, the peer review mechanism. So managing diversity, in my view, had been identified as one of the triggers of conflict on the continent. And I think it still continues to be, as we see what is happening on the continent currently. So that was the reason why managing diversity was important for the first TANA Forum. State fragility was the same, because you could see one state that is very powerful today. When there's one trigger of conflict, everything crumbles and it becomes a conflict state. So those were seen as key triggers of instability on the continent, and they were deemed to be fit to be the first topics for discussion.
And you had similar topics, themes developed over the years, right?
Over the years, there were now structures. Yes, for each forum. The TANA Forum had an advisory board, which worked very closely with the chair of the forum. And then there was also a technical committee of experts, which would also then work with the TANA Secretariat to work through technical ranking of what were the current and important issues for the continent, which would then be submitted to the board and the chair for approval. So that is how topics were chosen over the 10 years.
So, invited to this forum, where over the years where uh, presidents active, uh, retired, and so on and so forth. How frank was the discussion when you organized these forums?
I think I can use the first one as an example, that the idea was then that we don't say, oh, Honorable Excellency, the president of such and such a country. If you know their name, call them by name. And they would also call each other by name. And I remember the first forum whereby, to demonstrate the informality nature of the forum, former President Obasanjo, he took off his hat and threw it on the floor after he had done his welcome, and he basically took off his three-piece top and threw it on the floor to just say, now I am Obasanjo. I'm not Excellency. I'm not former president. Let's be frank with each other. Let's put our issues on the table.
In your report, you mentioned the importance of African ownership in peace and security issues. Do you think the TANA Forum has contributed something significant along that line?
I would say yes, because first of all, the TANA Forum was conceptualized by Africans, and by design, it was an African idea, in African intelligence, African participation, and the outcomes of the TANA Forum, one could say that they were ideas of Africans being put forward for implementation by various stakeholders. So the ownership was there at the idea level, but I would say, except for the Ethiopian government, in terms of contributing funds, in terms of contributing money, that is where the challenge has been, because it has been mostly GIZ. And I mentioned also that initially it was the Ethiopian government and some Ethiopian entities that were contributing for the first one. But by 2022, we had 26 international partners that were now contributing one way or the other to the funding of the TANA Forum.
And from outside of the continent?
From outside the continent and from within. And that has its own challenges, because then that ended up diluting the agenda of the forum. Everybody, once they put in their money, no matter how big or how little, they also now want to have a say. So they would end up wanting to have a side event, which then, in my view, detracted a lot from the focus of the TANA Forum and how it was initially conceptualized, that a few people would come together, brainstorm, focus, and come up with some ideas of how to resolve some of the peace and security issues on the continent. And I think this is a problem not just with the TANA Forum. We see it across the board on the peace and security and development agenda of the continent.
So what you're saying is that those funders had a say in designing the themes, the annual themes for your forum?
Not necessarily, not in designing the themes, but it was once you have decided, they now want also to participate. They want to have a side event. And initially, the decision had been that there will not be more than 90 people participating in the TANA Forum at any one time, because then that would enable a few people to be more focused and everybody to have an opportunity to have a say. But the last TANA Forum, we ended up exceeding 200, because once people have put in their money, they expect an invitation and participation. And I think it ended up being difficult to say no.
So that made things unmanageable, would you say?
I think it made it very unmanageable. In one way, one could say it shows that the TANA Forum was a success. Everybody was interested, but then from an organizing point of view, that wasn't the original intention. So it ended up being, in my view,
would derailed be the word?
I would say so, yeah. The agenda was derailed.
You
So
said
there's a need to refocus.
yes. You suggested early on in this conversation that it was inclusive, right?
Yes.
How so?
It was inclusive in that it included young people, it included women, not just on the panel, not just in terms of participation, but on the panels as well. It included regional representation. People from across the regions were invited as well as experts. And it was open. A young man or young woman could stand up and say their views in a panel of former heads of state and sitting heads of state and international experts as well. So that way they could also learn, but also hearing other perspectives from young people, old people that have experience. So it was a mutually benefiting environment for everybody who participated.
So their voices were equally heard because you
Equally
have heads
had,
of state on one side and commoners on the other.
yes, and that is what excited most people because for them they have not even sat in the same room with their own head of state at home, but here they're sitting with more than 5 sitting heads of state and maybe 6 former heads of state. So it was very experience giving to young people, and that is what they appreciated most. Private sector people as well, heads of companies were also there, everybody being challenged on the basis of their ideas and not their position.
So we had this forum in Bahadar for consecutive 8 years up until
Yes.
2022, but you never had one in 2021, right? That was
Yeah, because of the COVID.
because of COVID. Where does TANA Forum
Yeah.
stand today?
I I've not been very closely linked with it since 2022 when we celebrated the 10 years in Bada. But it has not held since 2022, which is now, we're now in the 3rd year without it holding. And for one reason or the other, the organizers have been postponing.
Overall, was was it worth having the TANA Forum in the first place? Do you think?
I think it was worth having and it's worthy to continue to have. But if it's for the future, I think some of these ideas that have been raised in my book, I think it's point for reflection. That's why I entitled it, It's a Reflection. And why it was a good thing to have in the first place is because a lot of ideas have been put on the table. And many people have been asking if the TANA has been successful. And the point is, yes, it has been successful in meeting the objectives of why it was set up in the first place. It was an idea generation platform, a platform for people to meet. And also, the heads of state would meet privately to deal practically with issues pertaining to, let's say, Sudan. The chair would bring together people of relevance to say on the side, let's discuss these matters. So it wasn't just what was happening in the room, in the plenary. It was also those side meetings, the private meetings. People would take advantage of that occasion to discuss some of the ongoing peace and security challenges. So it was very worthy to have, and it should continue, but in a revived way.
Yeah. Was the African Union was supposed to be one of the top consumers of the products that you came up with over the years, right?
Yes.
Did it?
I think
Did
what
it?
lacked there was that there was no mechanism that would formally take the ideas or the conclusions from the TANA Forum and channel them to the structures of the AU so that they become part and parcel of the AU decisions at summit level.
How do you rate the TANA Forum? Because there have been a few similar initiatives on the African continent.
I would say just like NEPAD, I would say the New Africa Partnership for Africa's Development, I would say 10 out of 10 initially, especially for the TANA Forum from an advocacy point of view, idea generation, because it wasn't meant to be an implementing mechanism. So I would say 10 out of 10. But then after having achieved that success, there would have been need for Dr. Mlugeta would call it a reboot, to say we have achieved, but how do we gain more impact on the ground? Because that is what people are now asking for. Peace and security on the ground is not going to be achieved just by generating ideas. What then can we do on the ground? So how can the TANA Forum be upgraded to contribute towards action on the ground in terms of peace and security?
So you took the initiative in writing this publication, TANA at 10, a celebration. Um, how difficult was it? Because I know that you have interviewed a number of people who have actively participated right from its inception all the way to 2 years ago. How challenging was getting this publication right?
I think one of the challenges was that when you seek, because I'm now outside the TANA process, people, but I'm also an academic, I like writing necessarily on African issues. But this one was more like, this is my baby. We have to get it right. We have to learn from our mistakes, and we have to celebrate what was achieved during very challenging times as well. So when you then engage people in terms of, can I interview you? It will almost be like you are not from the TANA Secretariat. But for me, this was a personal endeavor based on what I felt personally I gave to the forum, especially during the early days, and also for us to write our history so that tomorrow we don't repeat the same mistakes, because a young person of 25 today may never know this happened and they may want to repeat it in the next 10 years. So we avoid that. We put it there for people to reflect, but also to just say we did quite a lot as Africans and we need to celebrate ourselves and pat ourselves on the back in spite of the challenges that we continue to face.
Dr. Hesphina Rukato, thank you very much for your thoughts. It was a pleasure having you on my show again. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you.